welcome back to Creations with X. Today I will be explaining all about the different tools used in knitting. So just sit back and enjoy the video. So first off, I'm going to start off with the most common and necessary tool in knitting needles. So I just have several different sizes here. These ones are quite big, and I'm just going to explain. These are 4.5 millimeter knitting needles, or a US size 7. I usually go by the metric system. I find it is easier and more precise when it comes to tools, so just be aware of that if you don't use the metric system. These are metal or aluminum knitting needles. I honestly prefer needles made of aluminum because I find it's easier when the yarn just slips over it significantly easier than it does wood or plastic, such as these ones. This is just like an orange plastic. Plastic is not my favorite material when it comes to knitting needles. Just something to be aware of. You have metal, plastic, such as this one, and wood. Those are the general ones. These are a 7 millimeter knitting needle, or I'm not entirely sure what the US measurement is, but these are the 7 millimeter knitting needles, and they're wood. I like wood. They're good for knitting. They're my second favorite when it comes to types of materials for knitting needles. First is aluminum, second is wood, third is plastic. I don't like plastic much. But these are, at least in my area, extremely hard to find in stores. These were ordered online. I could not find a pair in store. So, just something to be consider. Just something to be aware of, unless they just so happen to have them in your area. And these are my 10 millimeter wooden knitting needles. These are quite thick. Different needle. It depends. These are quite thick. 10 millimeters is a bit big. They're not the biggest. There are other sizes. There are 25 millimeter knitting needles. Those are huge. Right here I have 25 millimeter knitting needles. These are plastic and a little bit dusty because I don't really use them. Like, ever. Might have been like one project. These are 25 millimeter knitting needles, and you can see, compared to the size of my hand, just how big they are. I don't really use those for much. I just kind of sit there because they're huge. These are 20 millimeter knitting needles, made of wood, and compared to my hand, and just a bit thinner than 25 millimeters. So you can see just a 5 millimeter difference. This is a 5 millimeter difference, and you can see the thickness. You can see the difference between the two. For 20 millimeter knitting needles, I've used these for a couple projects, believe it or not. This is good for this is a good size for a crocheting technique known as broomstick crochet, in which you need a very thick piece of wood, about maybe like a broomstick, like about the circumference of a broomstick. So this works well. This type of knitting needle is good for that type of crochet. Now, I'm going to move on to more exciting needle, to some different kinds. Next, we're going to be talking about circular knitting needles. So, these are knitting needles that come in a circle. Here is some out of a package. They are two knitting needles, two very short knitting needles, attached together with a cord. Now, I know you can they also make these kits in stores where you have like the knitting needles, and then you can detach the cord and attach them onto another knitting needle, which honestly I think is quite smart. It would definitely save you money if you wanted to knit circularly but didn't want to have a ton of don't have a ton of money to spend on circular knitting needles or space, because you just have the tops and then you can detach the cords. You can attach them, and you also have different size cords, because for example, this might be a 32-inch cord. I had to look at the packaging. This is a 16-inch cord. So you see how short it is compared to this? There's this one. This one. It'd also be a 16-inch. But you see the difference in length compared to the other ones? This one specifically says 29-inch. So this cord is 29 inches long, and the needles are 5 millimeters. So this is a 5 millimeter circular knitting needle with a 29-inch cord. And this is important because some projects require a specific length of cord in order to complete them if you're doing circular knitting. If you are making, or if you're making a project such as a hat, it would definitely be wise to use a shorter cord. So longer projects require longer cords. It doesn't even have to be circular. You could be making a, you could just be making a really large project. Sorry. You could just be making a really large project and need a large cord to just help take the weight off your hands. So you could also, and that's circular needles. These are also 7 millimeter knitting needles, by the way, this one. Just thought it'd be fun to point that out. Next up are double-pointed knitting needles. So, it's exactly as it sounds. Each end has a point. These are also used for knitting circularly, as you would use multiple at a time. So, be something like that. You could have 2 working the project, and you could have 2 holding the project and a third working it. Just a third knitting it together. You could have 3 together. It could look something like that, just holding the project. It's not perfect, but it is a rough demonstration of how it might look. So the needles keep rolling off each other. But some projects will call for this. So like smaller projects, you would definitely be using double-pointed knitting needles for instead of circular, as there's a bit more, as you can get a bit smaller with these. So with circular knitting needles such as this one, it's quite small. If your project goes to below a certain stitch count, it might be really hard to get the stitches around the cable, so this is really good. So you can get, if you had, like, say, 10 stitches, you were using 3 needles, you could have 5 stitches on each of these 2 needles and be knitting it with this third one. You wouldn't be able to have 10 on here. It's too big for 10 stitches. But for these, it makes it significantly easier to knit circularly with smaller stitch counts, like for socks or for mittens, gloves, things like that. I'm just going to put these back real quick. So it's for things like that you would use these. Now these are 4 millimeters. These are 4 millimeter double-pointed knitting needles. They are quite handy. Again, if you want to work things circularly, these can also be good for finishing things off if a project gets too small for the needle you're using, like the length of the cord. So that's that. Now to get into a couple other fun things. So, this is a cable needle, or, well, one type of cable needle anyway. You can also use it to help move stitches by kind of taking it off and just kind of holding the stitches here. So, cable needles aren't used in normal knitting so much as for when you're making, except for when you're making cables. So this is just, so you wouldn't be using this much. It's really just something to hold stitches, to put stitches on so you can temporarily move them to like wherever you're doing cabling. But this isn't commonly seen. There's also another kind. There's also another kind where it kind of looks like it's kind of straight, but goes straight and then has a little dip in the middle. So it's kind of like straight, then a dip, then straight again. That's also used, so it could be either one. And then we have these. These are stitch markers. These help to tell when, like, these can help to pinpoint a specific place in your knitting or crochet. So you would put these on the needle. These are specifically for knitting, the circular ones. You can see a little picture. But you see, you would slip it onto the needle and then just kind of knit until you get back to that place, or back to the stitch marker, and it can help to pinpoint it. These are more for crocheting, because in crocheting, if you have a stitch marker, it usually you need to be able to take it out. Crochet is significantly different from knitting, because if you used a knitting stitch marker in crochet, you might lose it forever, because you can't get it out again. But for knitting, you can also use these for knitting. You just have to secure safety clips. So you just need a way to take them out again. So this is good for, it's like a little plastic safety pin almost, where you can just hook it in and out. It's kind of stiff, but usually they're used for crochet, and these are for knitting because you just take it off the hook or the needle when you get to this point. I have finally 2 more things I would just like to show you. This is a stitch holder. Now, this doesn't have to be limited to knitting. It can also be used for other things, such as another thing called finger knitting, or just holding stitches you want to hold onto, or moving a small project on that you don't want to get unraveled. But you would take this, you would slip the stitches onto it using this point, and then you would simply push up like that to secure it. These are really handy. I do use these. These are quite handy for just projects in general. Any loose stitches, live stitches, good for crochet if you have like a project and you don't want it to come unraveled, you could just slip it through that one live stitch. Knitting, again, same thing. Slip it through the live stitches. You could also just use a safety pin if it's just one that you have a concern about, or maybe 2. And finally, this handy dandy gauge. So, this is kind of like it says knit check here. It's really handy. This is a very handy tool. So on it, it has what is known as a knitting gauge. So you see all these holes? These holes are used to tell what size a needle is. So you can take so let's take our 7mm from before. They don't have a 7mm hole, but it's okay. So you would stick your knitting needle into the hole to try and find out what size it is. So you see they don't have a 7mm hole. They only have 6.5 to 8. I'm telling you, 7mm knitting needles are very elusive. So this is a 4.5, and you see goes in. See how far it goes? That should be your test. That is 4.5 or a 7mm knitting needle. 4.5mm, not 7mm. Oh, it has tells you the millimeter and also the crochet hook sizes down here. You can also use these for crochet hooks. This is for gauge swatching. So this is So a gauge swatch is basically to tell you kind of like how your tension is. So it could be like you need this many stitches across high and this many stitches across that to get this pattern correct. Or to like make sure your sizing is accurate. So it just has 2 inches up, 2 inches down, and you can just put it down and count your stitches like that. Also has a small ruler on top in centimeters, or I think centimeters. And this is the back, just plain metal. Small ruler on the bottom, inches, 5 inches across. And I do find this handy for when you're taken by surprise. Like, it has measurement, so like, so this is a 375. So you see it doesn't have any markings on it, but I'm able to tell because of how I can fit it in there. Really quite handy. So yeah. That is all my explanation for, so yeah, that is a bunch of different knitting odds and ends and tools just explained. I hope this is helpful. If you have any questions, just leave them in the comments and I will try my best to answer them. And thank you for watching.